Okay. Okay, so I'm going to talk to you today about Hydromedia. This project arises out of my earlier work on the Anthropocene, and some of the concerns that I dealt with in that little book on minimal ethics are still present in this work. And I'm also trying to work with the concept of the medium that I investigated in some earlier works, including the book about the life after new media written with Sarah Kember. I'm also trying, it's a kind of new project, this thing on hydromedia. And I'm trying to open up the concept, the definition of media, but also trying to think of ourselves in the kind of mediated landscape context that we find ourselves in, and to rethink human and non-human relations through the concept of mediation. And water becomes a medium that is important for me in this. But so bear with me, it's a kind of a piece I've been writing, but it might become a bit of a bigger project at some point. I've been kind of looking at water as well as living with water and being water for a long time, but that project itself, conceptually, visually, it's still relatively new. So please bear this in mind. Okay, so with the term hydromedia, I refer to media that not only engage with water as their subject, but are also themselves aqueous, that is entangled with waterly flows, processes, networks, and infrastructures. So my aim today is to sketch out a dynamic and fluid ontology of the world, one that also recognizes the scholar's location in medias res, or in the middle of things, in media. I want to start from suggesting that all media can be understood as hydromedia. And it is because water is involved in the production, transportation, and usage of media devices. The excavation of minerals that serve as media components, the cooling down of computer servers, not to mention the actual makeup of human media users, 60% of whose bodies and 77% of whose brains are constituted of water. Water thus literally saturates media ecologies, binding media subjects and media objects into a liquid dynamic of exchanges. Yet water also constantly threatens the functioning of media devices and infrastructures, of course, if it appears out of place or in excess, resulting in a hydrophobia that makes media users perceive contact with water as antithetical to good media use. For example, when a phone is dunked in a toilet, or coffee spilled over a laptop, or a network grid is flooded, all the things that only become exacerbated now under the COVID situation, where we're all kind of spending our lives around those media devices. So understanding media in terms of hydromedia is a way of opening up, positioning, kind of moving beyond, to adapt a phrase from Melody Jew, moving beyond the terrestrial bias of media theory. And an approach, which is an approach that assumes the solidity, grounding, and dryness of its object of study. You could argue that most of kind of media theory, most of theory, or most of philosophy, most of Western thought has been a kind of has had this terrestrial bias. And the attempt is to move beyond that and also open up a new understanding of the subject, the researcher, as a kind of watery being. But it's also a way of shifting scholarly focus from the boundedness of media as both carriers of meaning and material entities, and towards a more entangled, to use that kind of frequently used word, media epistemology. So the concept of hydromedia situates the study of media in a wider environmental perspective. And here I've listed a number of books, texts with which I'm in conversation implicitly in this paper and explicitly in some of my other writings, people who are writing about media in the ecological context. Now, such environmental approach is not new in media theory. So even though these texts are recent, in the writings of Harold Innis, railroads and trade routes were seen as part of the extensive communications network, while Neil Postman, drawing on the work of Innis' colleagues at the University of Toronto, Marshall McLuhan and others, postulated the notion of media ecology. So we're going back to kind of North America, to Canada and the United States, to look at media in this expanded understanding and expanded context. Postman defined media ecology as the study of media as environments, that is, as extended networks of relations that go beyond media text and objects to include whole infrastructures, as well as media users' bodies and minds. In recent years, this media ecological approach has gained a new modulation under the umbrella of eco-media by becoming attached to environmental concerns related to climate change, the depletion of planetary resources, and the illogic of the extractivist economy that fuels the global production and consumption of goods. In his 2015 book, The Marvelous Clouds, Toward a Philosophy of Elemental Media, John Durham Peters declared an affinity with theories of media ecology when he posited that to understand media, we need to understand fire, aqueducts, power grids, seeds, sewage systems, DNA, mathematics, sex, music, daydreams, and insulation. Yet Peters claimed that this conceptual expansion was in fact a return to a pre-media studies concept of media, developed at a time when disciplinary fragmentation hadn't yet instituted a two cultures approach that ended up separating Geist from Natur, or the humanities from the sciences, from the natural sciences. As highlighted by German theorist Jochen Hörisch, well into the 19th century, when one spoke of media, one typically meant the natural elements such as water and earth, fire and air. And it's precisely in reconnecting media to their infrastructures and environments that Peters located the intellectual task of media theory today, a task that is made ever so urgent by the exigencies of the multiple ecological disasters unfolding in different parts of the globe. Now, drawing on Peters's ideas, I want to suggest that water is not only a component of media, but also that, alongside computers and other electronics, water itself is a medium. It connects, communicates, saturates, permeates, and engulfs. My talk is therefore framed by a double proposition. One, all media can be understood as hydromedia, but two, water itself is a medium that saturates our environment by means of multiple processes of connection, communication, solidification, and rupture. The aim of making this double proposition is to draw an ecological media theory with a view to denaturalizing our thinking about water, while also taking some steps towards considering the kind of ecologies we want to bring about and live in. Now, for many citizens of what has clumsily and inadequately been called the global north, the west, or the developed world, and especially those living in relatively affluent urban conglomerations, the fact that water is an all-pervasive medium which saturates their environment, as well as their bodies and minds, tends to recede to the background, precisely because the flow of water is so well regulated. So we tend to literalize the anecdote recounted by David Foster Wallace in his 2005 commencement speech at Kenyon College, Ohio, where he said, "There are these two young fish swimming along, and they happen to meet an older fish swimming the other way, who nods at them and says, 'Morning, boys, how's the water?' And the two young fish swim on for a bit, and then eventually one of them looks over at the other one and goes, 'What the hell is water?'" The anecdote, a version of which we can find in Marshall McLuhan and Quentin Fiore's War and Peace in the Global Village, had a pedagogic purpose. Using water as a metaphor for submersion in one's surroundings, it instructed the students that the most obvious, ubiquitous, important realities are often the ones that are the hardest to see and talk about. With this, Wallace was encouraging students to become more aware of what was around them, the ideologies that shaped their lives, the myths and meanings transmitted by these ideologies. So the fish story lends itself to the purpose of my argument because it implicitly forces us to raise the following question. What if water wasn't just a metaphor drawn on to illustrate a point, but rather the most obvious, ubiquitous, important reality Wallace highlighted? Do we actually know what the hell water is? Or do we perhaps need to develop something like water literacy? In line with the idea of hydromedia outlined earlier, which is aimed at liberating water from any metaphysical connotations of immediacy, purity, and naturalness, and at rethinking water as a medium, I propose to understand water literacy as a form of media literacy. Now, media literacy is highlighted by many educators as a key skill for living in the modern world. It is defined most comprehensively as the ability to access, analyze, evaluate, and create media in a variety of forms. Media education, whose goal is to develop this ability, is something that is recommended for all age groups, starting from school children. And again, we could argue that under the COVID conditions, this kind of need for media literacy has become even kind of more visible and more pressing, and both amongst the students and school children, but also amongst the kind of teaching body, both in schools and in universities. While some media scholars equate it with communication competency amongst a wider public, Justin Lewis and Sud Jali go so far as to suggest that media literacy's function is to help people to become sophisticated citizens rather than sophisticated consumers by engaging and challenging media institutions instead of just focusing on reading media texts. Yet if we take heed of Peters's argument that media are not only devices of information, but also agencies of order, and that rather than just send messages about our economic and ecological systems, they are constitutive parts of those systems, then we need to expand the understanding of what such media education will entail, beyond its conventional sense arising from mass media and information theory. Media literacy wouldn't then be about, understanding messages from the BBC or from right-wing websites, being able to decode them, would be also, although it would involve that too, but also would become a way of discovering how we humans construct, differentiate ourselves from, and subsequently use nature. Peters's concept of elemental media foregrounds the foundational yet partly invisible elements that lie at the base of our habitat: water, earth, fire, and air. By placing them in the foreground, we can change our understanding of what is around us, while also altering and expanding what's possible. So unlike the fish in the kind of McLuhan and Foster Wallace story, we can become aware of the water. So in other words, we can take some steps towards practicing politics in more aqueous modes. To borrow a phrase from Cecilia Chen, Janine MacLeod, and Astrida Neymanis's anthology, Thinking with Water. And it's in this sense that media literacy needs to incorporate or even become a form of water literacy. So how do we develop this particular form of media literacy? How do we analyze water as the elemental medium that saturates everything? How do we enter into more responsible relations with water in its different forms and flows? To approach these questions in the further part of this talk, I would like to look at some projects that have taken on the water literacy agenda. A hugely successful water education center called Hydropolis in Poland, and the virtual museum of digital water developed by Canadian artist Pipin Barr. Hydropolis, which opened in December 2015, is located in a 19th century underground pure water tank covering a floor area of 4,000 square meters. On entering the space, visitors are faced with a 46.5 meter long water curtain. You can see this thing with circles when you look to the right of the picture, the see-through. It's just water. It's a water curtain. It's actually a water printer. Spelling the attraction's name and other phrases. Well, at the moment, again, you can see some circles, basically. So the curtain miraculously parts when you pick up the courage to risk soaking and brave the entryway peering from behind the cascade. Interestingly, this is one of the very few direct encounters with water as a wet medium within the exhibition space. On finding ourselves inside the building, we are guided through a sequence of screening rooms, multimedia setups, touch screens, scroll down panels, and light and sound installations, which all engross water in a technologically sophisticated media environment. The exhibition space is divided into thematic zones. It starts with the planet of water, a 360-degree projection on a huge screen telling the story of the origins of water on Earth. From there, we encouraged to follow a water path, a blue glowing rivulet-like line in the floor covered with thick glass. There is plenty to do in Hydropolis. We can admire 3D replicas of deep water creatures, play a computer game about water, take a selfie with a giant whale slowly passing behind us on a large screen, see how a whirlwind or a snowstorm are formed, or attend a concert. Yet a rare hands-on demonstration inside, in the majority of these encounters, we are experiencing water in the form of screen saturation. In other words, we see it turned into pixels and then projected onto screens of various shapes and sizes, with their rich colors and perfect rendition of motion, creating an illusion of immediacy and liveness. Now, this is not meant as criticism. I actually love Hydropolis, and anytime I go to Wrocław, which is my birthplace and where perhaps understandably, I revert to being a child, I can't wait to visit it again. Yet Hydropolis is also fascinating for me as a media scholar interested in all kinds of ecologies, as it offers a testing ground for figuring out what it means to experience water as a constitutive and all-pervasive medium. And I'll come to explaining the slightly mysterious picture of flooding in a minute. So the instant screen saturation in the exhibition space, both in the sense of the high number of screens of different sizes and shapes that are available there, and in the sense of the vividness and intensity of the screens on display, creates a sensory experience that does more than just teach us about water. It creates a simulation of what it means to be saturated, immersed, engulfed. Water as seen on the screen becomes here a multisensory mediation of that elemental medium whose presence comes to us via technologies and devices. Could we go so far as to suggest that by structuring Hydropolis as a multimedial experience, the curators have done more than just replicate the widespread tendency to edutain in contemporary museum spaces, giving audiences what they already know and like? Have they, inadvertently perhaps, succeeded in establishing a continuity between communication media, such as text, image, and sound, and their more elemental counterparts? Peters was aware that his proposition to treat water and other elements as media would be seen by some scholars as a transgression. Media, some friends and colleagues have told me, he revealed, are about humans, and more specifically about vehicles that mark human meaning and intention. To say that the sea, the earth, fire, or the sky is a medium in this view is to dilute the concept beyond the limit of utility. So they were the criticism that were raised against his book, Elemental Media. Yet Peters was prepared to follow biosemiotics in recognizing that there was meaning in the world beyond human intentionality, revealing itself as it did in the form of readable data to different beings outside the human. This realization led Peters to propose a population evolving in intelligent interaction with its environment as an alternative, expanded model of communication. So the expanded forms of communication embraced by Hydropolis could be described as providing a safe space in which we can take the time to immerse ourselves in aqueous modes of being, in watery modes of being. This point becomes especially pertinent in the light of the memory of the 1997 Central European floods of the Oder and Moltava rivers as a result of excessive rainfall, which seriously affected Wrocław and its neighboring areas. It was a huge thing actually in Central Europe in 1997, causing 56 deaths in Wrocław, $3.5 billion worth of damage there, and affecting lots of other places. And it was the first time in centuries that the inhabitants of this historic European town of mixed German and Polish heritage, sometimes called the Venice of the North, due to its positioning on the Oder River with its four estuaries and its being surrounded by a moat and numerous canals, had been faced with water that completely defied regulation and taming. Incidentally, as I was living in the UK already at that time, I already know this 1,000-year flood, as it became known, in my original hometown as a media event, transmitted via family stories, photographs, and news reports, and regularly commemorated in online and offline exhibitions. Hydropolis thus creates a sensation of water as an elemental medium by using the media we have let ourselves be flooded by: monitors, computers, game consoles. In this way, it reprises the ontological experience of fluidity and saturation, while also turning it into a cognitive task, a space of taking some distance, of learning when to take the plunge. We could describe this approach as a Goldilocks model of water literacy. Prudent and responsible water literacy doesn't stand for immersion in some fantasy primordial soup, a return to nature and the elements from before the time of media and technology. Instead, the elemental theory of media generates a responsibility to account for the infrastructures and connections we have developed, without repudiating them altogether. While returning to, say, washing clothes in a stream rather than in a washing machine would in a certain sense bring us closer into contact with water as such, the watery politics it would outline could end up being anti-feminist, in that it would return women who are still the main deliverers of domestic tasks all over the world to time-consuming forms of labor that would limit their other activities. So which is why I'm not proposing any kind of, closeness to water as a more natural existential relationship with the medium, not at all. And I appreciate forms of mediation and distanciation as sometimes having kind of political affordances that can be beneficial to some groups. I'm just trying to understand how the relationship with water can be understood, lived through, and experienced, but I'm not calling for a return to water as such in a kind of Kantian noumenal sense as this thing, in itself. So in the spirit of the great debunker of water mythologies, Ivan Illich, for whom water was as much about urban architectures and indoor plumbing as it was about spaces of imagination, the way it was for Bachelard, my concept of water literacy doesn't therefore involve advocating a return to water as a source of purity or beauty either. Nor does it aim to reclaim a closer and more authentic relationship with water, as I mentioned, as some kind of origin or source, whether it occurs as a kind of originary cosmic soup, the ocean bed, or, the mother's womb. Instead, I want to view water as always mediated for us humans by the institutions and environments in which it is situated, and by the narratives that shape them. Chilean-German DJ Ricardo Villalobos's playful account of the club music scene in terms of a primal experience which is inherently technical offers an interesting perspective on water as a primordial mediated environment. So he says, you have 6 months listening to industrial techno inside the belly of your mother. Your heartbeat, the heartbeat of the mother, all these gastric waters surrounding you. Together it sounds like techno producer's basic channel. And the experience in the club is very similar to the experience in the belly of your mother, being enclosed, listening to this music. So the image of water as part of the original techno club sketches out a media ecology which is always already technical, and which sees humans as extensions of the originary technical dynamics at work in what we have designated as nature. Now, Canadian artist, scholar and game designer Pipin Barr, who in 2017 launched VR3, a virtual museum of digital water, has explored the technical modulations of water in an imaginative and surprising way. It's worth noting that rendering water is one of the most difficult, time-consuming and costly tasks in game design, a difficulty that has been taken up as a challenge by some of the more adventurous design companies. Through such experiments, game designers have positioned water explicitly as a medium, one whose realistic look and fidelity to the representationalist worldview are questioned by the larger media frame of the game itself. If Jay Bolter and Richard Grusin were right in suggesting that our culture wants to both multiply its media and to erase all traces of mediation, ideally it wants to erase its media in the very act of multiplying them, then artists such as Barr reverse this erasure by drawing our attention to the multiple media frames that encompass our habitat. His remediation of the game's rendition of water also reveals water's inherently mediatic character. Bar's VR3 project visualizes this point. Using the cross-platform game engine Unity's asset called Professional Water, which is known for its impressive reflections and generally high-tech feeling of the water, the artist designed a walk-through online gallery populated by displayed plinths, each topped with a framed rendition of water by a different game designer. The visitors can see digital water rippling, ebbing, and shimmering, while displaying amazingly saturated and rich tonality of various shades of blue. Water is, of course, not blue per se. It is rather its interaction with light, or more specifically, the selective absorption of the red part of its visible spectrum that renders it blue to the human eye. Bar's virtual museum teaches us to see water as a medium, while also revealing that there is no such thing as water itself, that it inevitably saturates something, and that it always comes to us mediated. Or as Robert Linton has it, water itself is constituted by relations. How we understand these relations is a task for what I'm calling here water literacy. How we in turn enter these relations, how we embrace or fight against the emergent saturation, becomes a task for aqueous politics. So any attempt to develop water literacy or build water politics must remain mindful of the warning issued by many environmental scholars, including Linton, about water's deterritorialization, that is, its reduction to an abstraction. In other words, it must resist considering water outside the multiple processes of saturation in which it participates. The questioning of our relationship to water and of its misperception, especially in affluent urban conglomerations, along with a call for a higher standard of water literacy, are not therefore meant to imply that the experience of citizens of relatively wealthy nations is the same all over the world, or that they all remain equally unaware of water's presence and force. Residents of the well-off Netherlands, for example, are permanently threatened with flooding, with their survival and economic success dependent on the smooth functioning of an elaborate system of defense involving dams, dikes, and floodgates. Inhabitants of both Southern Europe and Australia, in turn, have been experiencing increasingly high temperatures, extreme droughts, and deadly fires in the summer months, particularly in less urbanized areas, while Japan's food imports have been threatened by the water shortages of its trading partners, Australia, the US, and China. Yet it is perhaps not too much of an overstatement to suggest that in the more affluent parts of the globe, water makes itself seen and sensed as an issue only when its regular and normally well-managed flow is interrupted, either due to an infrastructural breakdown or due to what gets called an act of God, but which often results from human activity: flooding, hurricane, tsunami, snowstorm, mudslide, contamination, drought. Indeed, in places where water management has become a highly industrialized process, water is a controlled environment, or even a commercial product, shaped as a swimming and diving milieu, a bottled beverage, cool air, or all providing bodily comfort and pleasure. When water bursts into the modern subject's habitat and consciousness, it does so as a problem to be faced and an act of saturation to be reckoned with, often in a heavily mediatized form. Indeed, the experience of a natural disaster resulting from the lack of excess of the watery flow arrives to many courtesy of the global networked media, with events of water excess or water scarcity unfolding on oversaturated screens 24/7 via the deluge of news feeds, images, videos, emails, and social media posts. Even if a population has had an out of the ordinary direct, yet never unmediated encounter with a water emergency, once the regulation and management of the water flow has resumed, this encounter lives on in their memory predominantly as a media event. That is to say, its memory is shaped and conserved by the event's representations on the shared media networks and platforms, previously television, but nowadays increasingly more and more social media, as well as news feeds online. In the affluent, or what journalist Dayo Olopade has called fat economies, water is thus present in the same way that death is. Saturating everything and touching everyone, it has been relegated to the technical system of management and regulation, whose presence only makes itself felt once the system comes to a halt. Yet this experience of water's deterritorialization through its abstraction is not universally shared. Cécile Roubaud explains that different places across the world have developed different regimes of water, diverse practices of living with water, and various bodily techniques of taking in water, the ways in which clothes and bodies are washed, and the amount of soap used, the sea navigated, and different sources of fresh water distributed. In that way, we may see bodies do water differently by processing and performing water with pliant technologies. That was a quote from Roubaud. Paradoxically, water's mediatic aspects come to the fore less explicitly in the highly mediatized societies which depend on supposedly advanced digital media technological networks for their functioning and their self-image. Water's status as a living medium, whose fluid nature is being constantly reconfigured, thus becomes more acutely visible and can be more forcefully sensed in the non-urban areas of Chad and Greenland, India and Peru, that is in Olopade's lean societies which approach consumption and production with scarcity in mind. In such lean societies, water is literally and visibly entangled with its surroundings. It shapes landscapes, configures societies, establishes communities, and forms worldviews. It does this across the globe, of course, but its ontology as a life-giving and all-encompassing medium is better comprehended and taken on in communities and environments where living with water hasn't been outsourced to the high-tech industrial complex. More importantly, the world's geopolitical map itself undergoes a redrafting process when seen from the vantage point of flow of water. Indeed, water challenges or even liquidates the distinctions between developed and developing countries, between the global north and the global south, or between fat and lean economies. All these terms are used in quotation marks. Because as shown by examples such as, 2005 Hurricane Katrina in the southeastern US, which cost over 1,200 lives and caused billions of damage to property and infrastructure, or the 2003 heat wave in France, in which nearly 15,000 frail and elderly died due to dehydration. The demarcation lines between safe zones, that is water managed zones where water doesn't need to be seen and known, and unsafe ones, which is zones where water comes to the fore of people's bodies and minds as either excess or scarcity, so the lines become blurred within, one particular space, country, the US or France here. The geopolitical divisions are therefore to a large extent socio-economic, which is why it is possible to inhabit two completely different worlds while living in the same country or even city. And we are experiencing the same situation again with COVID and the geopolitics around that. So I'm moving to a final part of my talk, which is called From Hydrological Orientalism to Aqueous Politics. Now, the discussion of how different regions and different sections of society situate themselves in relation to water brings me to the suggestion that a call for water literacy as a form of media literacy is thus a call for opening up the Eurocentric, modernist, liberal, humanist political worldview that sees all locations and old worldviews produced in them as mirror images of their own. The process will need to entail challenging what Jamie Linton has called hydrological Orientalism, a privileging of northern geographies and northern perspectives in the accounts of water's ontology that naturalizes the presence of abundant surface water. In the naturalized neoliberal model of politics, which promises infinite growth and infinite return on resources, scarcity is seen as an aberration or an error to be corrected, rather than as a consequence of a particular fiscal or environmental politics. Even though the distinction between fat and lean economies introduced by Olopade may pose a danger of replicating the Orientalist mindset, which ends up perpetuating the difference between us and them, I take it up as first and foremost a moral accusation aimed at the instigators of the logic of techno-economic obesity that shapes the modern world, but also at its often unwitting benefactors. More importantly, this Eurocentric, modernist, liberal humanist political worldview is premised on the colonialist logic, a logic which still organizes our economic relations not only between different countries and regions, but also within them. In his book Cannibal Metaphysics, which is aimed at inventing the conditions for a thought cognizant of the theoretical imaginations of all peoples, Brazilian anthropologist Eduardo Viveiros de Castro calls the project of learning on the ground from those who have traditionally been situated outside the dominant framework of knowledge power a practical ontology. For Viveiros de Castro, knowing is no longer a way of representing the unknown, but of interacting with it, a way of creating rather than contemplating, reflecting, or communicating. Water literacy shouldn't therefore just be reduced to learning about water. Instead, it must invoke the creation of better ways of being in, with, or without water, which in turn needs to be underpinned by an understanding of water as a medium, via the processes of saturation it participates in. Within the particular landscapes, people engage in multiple strategies to safeguard the world, claims anthropologist Kirsten Hastrup in the richly illustrated collection Living with Environmental Change, Water Worlds, she co-edited with Cecilia Rubo, a book which very much permeates my thinking in this talk. Indeed, in my efforts to understand ways of living with water, with a view to developing what I term aqueous politics, I frequently turn to accounts of anthropological fieldwork. The contributors to Hastrup and Rubo's volume demonstrate how in many less industrialized parts of the world, from sub-Saharan Africa through to the Pacific Islands, the Andes, and the Arctic Circle, managing their relationship to water in the form of embarking on a daily walk to the well, moving herds to water sources, devising and operating low-cost pumps made from local materials, suffering months-long droughts, deriving one's livelihood from fishing and seal hunting, or using ice blocks to obtain drinking water and to store food, saturates many people's everyday lives. These water stories from different parts of the globe need to be told and heard, with anthropology serving as one of their most reliable transmitters. As Hastrup observes, drawing on the work of Tim Ingold, in its critical self-reflexivity, anthropology today involves not so much studying people out there, but rather studying with people, with a view to educating our perception of the world and opening our eyes and minds to other possibilities of being. Anthropological accounts are thus increasingly produced in medias res, implicitly adopting mediation as a structuring condition of the story, the teller, the researcher, and the environment, who all become something in the process. It is with the help of anthropology that we can grasp the complex ontology of hydromedia and the multiple processes of mediation they are part of. Acquiring water literacy as a form of media literacy will therefore mean developing better ways of being in and with the world by learning from locations that have traditionally been seen as marginal and liminal on the world's map. We need to distinguish here between local perspectives and what Hastrup calls a located perception of the environment. While the former, these local perspectives, may pose a danger of patronizingly celebrating pre-industrial relations to water as supposedly more authentic and more natural, while also keeping the benefits of industrial technology clearly on the side of the economic winners. This idea of located perception of the environment recognizes that all knowledges are produced in specific locations, and that these very locations are outcomes of particular forms of perception and action. Listening to stories about Chad, Greenland, India, and Peru, that allows us to unthink the medium of water as principally a resource and commodity, and to re-territorialize it again, to recognize the possibility of water entering other relations and making other geopolitical structures across the globe. It thus allows us, or indeed prompts us, to consider water's multiple resaturations. This step is not yet political in itself, but it does issue a call to responsibility while creating conditions for the emergence of a different setup of the world. So to sum up, the ultimate aspirations of my project on hydromedia, water literacy, and aqueous politics spring from a conviction that we need to stop seeing water as a mere resource for us humans and recognize it instead as a medium, a key component of both us and what we call the world. We also need to recognize that even though humans and water are mutually co-constituted, becoming partners in saturation, they also come together and apart in different ways, depending on their geographical and economic position. Human-water interactions, not just on the scale of individual organisms, but also on the scale of vast lands, regions, and geoscapes, are all ways of worlding, making the environment, creating societies of humans and non-humans, enacting politics. In recognition of these multiple ways of worlding, the project of water literacy needs to be premised on the decolonization of the Orientalist mindset that organizes the world according to the economic wishes and corporeal needs of the historically established agents of power. The proposed ontological shift towards a more saturated model of being with water, is therefore underpinned by a multiple ethico-political demand to repair historical injustice, which has resulted in the impairing of our own Western epistemological frameworks, and to learn from others about how to think and live otherwise. At a time when lofty yet disembodied notions of democracy and freedom are running rather thin, we need to work on developing more grounded, yet also more fluid modes of political thinking and action, modes that take our relations with the environment seriously, without fetishizing all those relations as more authentic or as a good in itself. Water literacy can thus become a way of training us in developing relationship differentials, that is, knowing when and how to cut through water flows. It can also allow us to see ourselves as both watery beings and as beings who are responsible for water infrastructures and water flows. Perceiving water as the elemental medium before it's turned into a resource, an industrial product, or a background to modern economies needs to be the first step on this journey. Exploring its modes of saturation, which are also modes of mediation, must become a longer-term strategy. Thank you.